closer. Okay, I'll try. Maybe like this? Or like that. Okay. Yeah, it's going to work. It always works, even though I have a very soft voice. I think I'm going to continue a little bit on what Carlo was saying, but I'm a lawyer, so my perspective is a little bit different because I work with political and constitutional asymmetries. And the topic that I'm working with today is placed within the realm of the constitutionalism of emergency, but also federalism, where I try to point out that new types of emergencies actually come from multinationalism or identity differences, if it makes you very anxious to say multinationalism. I'm going to start with the premise that we've been talking ever since yesterday about different types of emergency regimes, and we've seen that, ever since forever, but especially yesterday, we've seen that scholars researching constitutional emergency have long debated those traditional types of emergencies, such as armed conflict, insurgency, terrorism, and of course the pandemic, but also the economic crisis. And we've seen that one of the main obstacles that is linked to the constitutional emergency regimes is that they point to the limits of constitutionalism, and within those points of view that we've a little bit scratched on the surface yesterday, that one of the apparent mechanisms to reply to those emergency regimes is actually to use emergency powers. But then again, we have multinationalism, and I think Elizabeth mentioned it yesterday a little bit, or something, at least something along those lines, and the introduction today also pointed in that direction, that identity differences, as I said, if the word multinationalism makes you a little bit anxious, it is also recognized, at least in the federalism literature, as a contributory factor to emergencies. And because it actually produces intense relationships, but not abruptly, not immediately. It kind of builds up over the period of time, and then it creates situations which can be defined as emergencies. That is because different groups with different identity markers, of course, have the potential for political mobilization, something that Carlo just explained, and they may inspire other members of the group to pursue the changes within the system based on the differences in identity. And so when this occurs, the most likely outcome is that we have constitutional asymmetries, which are of course based on political asymmetries. What I argue here actually is, can we go to the second slide? Can we go to the second slide, please? The second, thank you. So what I argue here is that that there is a difference within with how we actually perceive the traditional crisis and how we perceive crises that are actually the effect of multinationalism crisis. So traditional crises are actually the crisis, as I said, war, rebellion, terrorism, the pandemic, the economic crisis, and so on. We don't have the unique way of classification. We call them state of emergency. We call them the state of exception, and we always, as I said, linked them to the concept of emergency powers. But then, when we talk about multinationalism, we have to have in mind that the reply to those is actually related to self-governance, and it's related to autonomy. Because at this point, and that is also one of the information that is provided to us by the Forum of Federations, that almost half of the world's population right now lives in federal-like countries. When Carlo said that the UK is possibly a unitary state, I kind of frowned, because as a federal scholar, I would normally call it a federal-like country, for example. And most of those countries are also multinational countries as well. So that is the obligation, our obligation to look, that is why we have the obligation to look into this. Because the response to this emerging fragmentation that I said happens over the time, so continuously, is actually introducing the constitutional asymmetries. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yes, thank you. So the two factors that are responsible for multinationalism that is entailing a potential for crisis is actually that is a challenge of multinational democracy that we know as one polity and multiple demoi, which means that various groups need to be institutionalized in order to accomplish unity among their different identities. But at the same time, we also know that most contemporary states feel a little bit uncomfortable with the idea of national diversity. So sometimes they even coercively press against diversity, and that has happened ever since forever. Even though asymmetry is a myth. Symmetry is a myth, because asymmetry has existed forever, and we see it also in the US, but also in Germany, in Switzerland, in the countries that we see as model federations as well. On the other side, we also have the paradox of diversity, which also means that multinationalism does produce conditions for successful but also unsuccessful accommodation of differences, and that is because identity differences, or multinationalism, whatever you want to call it, it triggers or produces, as I said, those types of emergencies that may threaten the survival of the system. It does provide a sustenance for constitutional asymmetries, but also it can also instigate asymmetrical constitutional solutions for the purpose of accommodating diversity. So there's kind of a love-hate balance, sort of, to stay. And we have lots of examples. Some of those examples were mentioned by Carlo, but we also have examples such as Bosnia and Herzegovina. We have the examples of Iraq, some very extreme examples of emergencies of that kind, but also we have Spain, we also have the UK, we also have even Italy, India, Pakistan, Myanmar, yeah, you name it. So all of these actually fall under those types of emergency regimes. Normal, can we go to the next slide, please? Normal instruments and mechanisms that are that go beyond emergency powers are applied because emergency powers do not make much sense. Here. But what makes sense, as I said, is constitutional asymmetry. It's the federal principles, technically, and constitutional asymmetry, not necessarily as a federal principle, but introducing, for example, intermediary tiers of government, etc., could be one of the reasons why we are talking about this. And to the next slide, please. The differences, and this is maybe the most important part of the presentation, why am I talking about this, is actually the difference of how traditional and how these contemporary effects of the exceptional circumstances actually appear. Traditional extreme circumstances, they appear abruptly. So we know the pandemic just happens, the war happens, the rebellion happens, but multinationalism happens to produce some kind of effects that build up incrementally. So it happens over the time, and then suddenly it creates an effect. Also, the second very important difference is that the traditional exceptional circumstances are in the opposition of the concept of normalcy. But those that are produced by multinationalism, they create new types of normalcy. So if there is a new internal division of the state, new or different institutional rearrangement, that is a new type of normalcy. that we accept as such. And that is in line with what we understand as temporal aspect of traditional effects of exceptional circumstances, which come for a specific amount of time and then they go. But with multinationalism, they're long-term, they're there to stay, because if we adapt the constitutional system to them, of course we expect them to keep their presence for a specific amount of time. And of course, the difference also between the constitutional effect is that traditionally there is a partial or complete suspension of the constitution, while with the multinationalism affecting the constitutional system in the way that I described, it is always that the constitutional provisions are there to accommodate in such way to match those demands. And of course, with the traditional exceptional circumstances, the importance is on expanding the executive powers that I just mentioned. But with the multinationalism, it is actually with splitting the powers between different tiers. As I said, introducing intermediary tiers of government is one of the ways, or how constitutional asymmetries appear, apart from territorial asymmetries, which is for example status, but also powers, fiscal autonomy, and so on. And to my last slide, please, what I'm trying to say is that we need to rethink how we think or how we research the emergency regime. So that is actually the conclusion. The conclusion is that we need the shift in understanding of the emergency regimes, at least in federal systems that incorporate identity differences. I will be happy to reply to all of the questions also on constitutional asymmetries, because I made career on that. So thank you very much.
We are lucky once again. She finished before the 15 minutes, but I'm sure we are not going to waste her time that she saved. May I now